On today's show, we got a great Alperen Şengün injury update.
Hey, Houston fans, I am so happy.
What it means for his recovery timeline and the team going forward. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Praise be to the basketball gods for taking it easy on Alperen Şengün. What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. The show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. Now, today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wondered what adventure could be around the very next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day. Thank you for being an everydayer, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for making the show part of your day every single day. Joining us now is none other than your weekly co-host, the Podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. And Ben, we are having, it feels weird to be joyous about finding out the extent of an injury for Alperen Şengün, but based on how bad things looked when we first witnessed the injury, the reporting surrounding it per Adrian Wojnarowski is such amazing news that we're going to get into and kind of discuss on today's show. So Woj reporting that Houston Rockets center Alperen Şengün has escaped major injury on his lower right leg, suffering a severely sprained ankle and a bone bruise on his knee. This is about as good of an outcome as we could have hoped for based on how bad that injury looked. We had all the Twitter doctors trying to analyze the tape and trying to, it really was almost reminiscent of like the Paul George injury from, way back when. And it looked, you could see the body language from Şengün. It was just awful. So to get this incredible news where, yes, he's still hurt. Yes, he's still going to have to rehab, but a sprained ankle is nowhere near as bad as some of what we thought it could have been, right? Like a hyperextended knee with some ACL or MCL damage, that kind of stuff. So this is honestly a complete godsend, right? The basketball gods, the sports gods, sometimes they giveth and sometimes they taketh, and they did take Alperen Şengün away from us, but at least the silver lining here is that the injury is not nearly as bad as what we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, this could have been devastating because let's be honest, Alperen Şengün is a tough guy. We know the last couple of months he's played through back pain. We've seen the rap. We know he's turned his ankle a few times this year, and he's been out there 63 of 64 games. He is an Iron Man. He is a guy the Rockets lean so heavily upon offensively, and for him to stay down for the amount of time that he did and accept going off on a wheelchair, a lot of these guys will try to at least walk and limp their way backstage if they can for further evaluation. For him to stay down as long as he did, to yell out in pain in the final seconds of honestly what should have been the feel-good win of the season, that looked pretty dire. So for the Rockets to escape impact beyond this season is massive. And it is for Şengün as well. Let's be honest. This is a guy who's put himself in the conversation for up to a max contract as soon as this offseason. And yet he has not gotten paid a dime yet beyond his original deal. So for Şengün in particular to have such a brilliant season and then have something like this potentially factor in a significant way, because how could it not, into his contract conversations, would have been devastating. He deserves better, and now he's going to get paid based on his production, be it this offseason or a year from now in restricted free agency, whenever the Rockets think it's best for them to do a deal. This is just, again, it's so huge for Şengün. He needs to be able to gear up for next season. And it sounds like this is the kind of injury, while he won't be full go at the start of the offseason, I think by the middle of it, he certainly should be. I think by July, August, he'll be able to start ramping up for camp. And then as far as the Rockets, look, next year is a big year for this franchise. That's really the pivot point. You need to see in year 4 for Jalen and LP, year 3 for Tari and Jabari. You're getting close to contract inflection points and all of those guys. What can this team be internally? It's the last year for Fred VanVleet. They took a step this year. Can they take another step next year? Hopefully they do. And if not, then there's going to be some hard decisions to be made. Well, if you didn't have Şengün for all or part of next season, then how could you even really take stock of where you're at when you're trying to make this big evaluation and yet your best player isn't even out there? So for the Rockets organizationally, they need Şengün to be a part of the picture for next season. And let's be honest, when there's an injury that happens this late in the NBA year, it's like when guys tear an ACL in the playoffs. They're typically not themselves until the year after the following season, simply because of the calendar. Training camp is only a little over 6 months away. So when you're talking about what looked like potentially a serious injury to both a knee and an ankle, there were so many bullets that had to be dodged in that MRI. And somehow Şengün and the Rockets appear to have done that. Again, it's not nothing, a severe ankle sprain, the bone bruise to his knee. Not trying to minimize that. It probably is going to end his season. But my guess is that if he gives it 3 or 4 months to heal, he should be able to start ramping up. And that's huge for LP. It's huge for the Rockets.
Now, Woj did follow up his initial tweet with a follow-up tweet saying that Şengün hasn't yet been ruled out for the season, but let's be completely honest here. There's, the Rockets competing for that final play-in spot in the Western Conference was a long shot anyways. They are currently behind the Golden State Warriors, I believe 6 or 6.5 games, factoring in the tiebreaker that the Warriors unfortunately hold over the Rockets. It would have been a long shot. You would have needed not only to close out the season on a very strong note, you would have also needed a lot of luck from, one of, if not both, of the Lakers and Warriors to kind of stumble towards the finish line to be able to secure one of those final play-in spots. It was a long shot anyways. So now the focus needs to be on Alperen Şengün and, rehabilitating, getting his body right. And I do think that when we look at the way this injury kind of played out, we have to give complete props to LP for being one of, if not maybe the most flexible big man in the entire NBA, right? We see all the pictures and the jokes about LP being flexible. We know he can do the splits. We know he does like the stretch where his leg is above his head and everything, but I really genuinely believe that his flexibility is what probably allowed him to sustain a fall like this and be able to, not walk away with such a debilitating injury. Again, not trying to minimize, like you already said, not trying to minimize the injuries that he is going to have to progress through. Because, if this is anything similar to, say, I don't know, like the Christian Wood ankle sprain from, a few years back during the initial stages of the Rockets rebuild, that ankle sprain kept Christian Wood out for 6 weeks, right? So we're talking, go ahead.
And one perfect parallel that I think will help Şengün, having seen this experience up close and personal, look at Jock Landale from last August when he suffered a severe ankle sprain in, I believe it was mid to late August. And of course, he reported to camp. He was available by the time the Rockets opened the season in late October. And he was terrible. He just was not ready. And he's since admitted to Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle that his ankle was still really messed up when the Rockets opened the season. It's why he wasn't himself. And it's taken until now, thankfully, because of this ankle sprain, now it's going to present an opportunity to Jock Landale, who has been playing better. But the point is, Landale tried to rush it. He came back within about 2 months because there was some game pressure. And he paid the price, and Şengün watched that. Şengün knows Jock Landale is a better player, and he's a better player now. So hopefully that experience is something Şengün can draw upon this offseason, not to try and push the envelope. Hey, let this take 2-3 months, whatever it takes. You had the benefit of time in the offseason. It's sort of a backstop. Wait until it's ready, and then you can be closer to, the flexibility that Jock Landale has now, as opposed to the flexibility that Jock Landale had in October and November, which was still pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, we are, currently about 6 months away from what would be the start of, training camp or thereabouts, somewhere September-ish. So hopefully it's something that, is going to be able to be, healed and 100% by then, or at least if not completely 100%, close to as 100% as possible. But it doesn't look like, at least right now, that this is going to be something that is going to, impact Şengün next season, force him to miss time next year, all that stuff, which is some of the major concerns from when we originally saw the injury take place. And one other parallel, right, to draw from is Şengün was recently on the Paul George podcast, right? And the closing question that he had for PG was, how did you make it back, right? How did you make it back from that injury? And so we can rest assured that PG, who's been one of the most vocal supporters of, established stars in the NBA landscape that has had nothing but high praise for Alperen Şengün, I am absolutely certain that PG is going to reach out to Şengün if he hasn't already, and that those two are going to, discuss this, and Şengün is going to have the right mentality towards getting his body back where it needs to be so that he can come back new and improved and even better than he previously was. On the other side, we're going to get into some of the other ramifications now that we know the results of Alperen Şengün's injury status. We're going to get into that, as well as we're going to talk about the Rockets' rotation changes without Alp and so much more. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small. Certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that stuff out, especially to someone who's unbiased when it comes to your life. Look, maybe you got in trouble at work or disagreement with a coworker or something. Maybe it's something in your personal life, right? Could be with a spouse or a sibling or a parent, any of that kind of stuff, right? If you bottle up those issues, then it can, boil over at the wrong moment. And that's what you don't want to have happen. Therapy can be different for everyone. I've done therapy in the past, and I found it to be an incredibly cathartic experience to have somebody who is an unbiased third party kind of help me walk through some of my own issues. And look, most of us have bigger problems than what's going on with our favorite sports teams, although as of 24 hours ago, this show was really depressing when we didn't know what was going to happen to Alperen Şengün, but things are looking a lot brighter now. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible, maybe as flexible as Alperen Şengün is, and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, one thing to consider here when we look at the timetable for Şengün's recovery, and we're going to talk about some, silver linings, some positives, and some unfortunate negatives, just kind of the overall ramifications now that we know the full extent of the injury. And I think one major downside, unfortunately, is even though Alperen Şengün had this phenomenal year 3 leap, right? It is unfortunate that he's probably going to be robbed of the majority of an offseason where you would have liked Şengün to have the opportunity to get back in the lab, to really develop and work on his game, to focus on his body, to do all the things that he did coming into year 3 when he was, locked in a gym in Santa Barbara and was working, tirelessly to get up to speed, to get his body to where he wanted it to be in preparation for this year 3. And that's why I think he started the season so strongly, as he really was dedicated to his craft in the offseason. And so, if he's going to be sidelined for 2 to 3 months while the ankle heals, and then another, month or two to kind of ramp up and get back up to speed for basketball activities, that is a really unfortunate side effect of just, the timeline of recovery for him.
But he can largely shoot, I would think. And that's, I think, was something that was going to be a focal point for him this offseason anyway. I mean, we've seen the free throws tail off a little bit. Now, three-point shooting might be a little trickier because you have to use your legs a little bit more for that. But I just think that that's something that was always going to be an emphasis for him. And thankfully, that's something that's not too ankle dependent. So at least to some degree, he can work on that during his rehab. I also think this was probably going to be more of a video-heavy offseason for Şengün to begin with, because unlike the last 2 years, this was a season in which the workload was really, really high for Alp. So my guess is that even had this not happened, he was probably already going to take some time off early in the offseason just to let his body recover, because he's been asked to do way more this season. Again, we've seen it. He's had a few ankle issues here or there. Obviously, the back is something that's sort of plagued him the last few weeks. So my guess is that he was already going to shut it down, at least for a small amount of time, no matter what. So I think that's the silver lining. We should also point out that, as far as the game totals, if he doesn't play again this year, he's at 63 games. That'll fall just below the NBA's threshold for awards voting. So most improved player was probably a long shot anyway. Now, unless he comes back, he probably won't be eligible for that. But the other way to look at that, while we should acknowledge, and it sucks for him on an individual level, sure, we would have liked to see him be an all-star. We want the best for him. We'd love to see him win most improved player. At the same time, that 65 game mark, the NBA sets that as its threshold because that's representative of basically a full season, enough to be considered a valid sample. And in the big picture, when we talk about not just Şengün, but the Rockets, it's important to remember that this injury occurred in March. It did not occur in December. So even if he does not come back, we have 63 games worth of data from Alperen Şengün, basically 75% of a season, that tells you that, yes, he is as good as the numbers suggest. So that's one little bit of peace of mind. This is not like an injury that happens early in the year, and if it knocks him out, you say, well, he was a really great player, but is he going to be able to get back to that form? No, we have a large enough sample now. I mean, selfishly, I would have loved to have seen it go 2 more games just for awards voting. But at the same time, you take a step back, 63 games is still a big, big sample. So in terms of projecting Şengün into next season and beyond, it is enough to where I think it's a lot better off. You have a lot fewer questions than had this injury happened a couple of months ago.
One other thing that I'm thinking about here, and just trying to wrap my head around all the different ramifications from this injury, is you mentioned it earlier, right? It does open up, potential opportunity more so now for Jock Landale, whose play as of late, right, finally playing like the Jock Landale the Rockets thought they were getting earlier in the offseason. Now, the Rockets did make a move ahead of the NBA trade deadline to go acquire Steven Adams. And let's face facts, right? Assuming Alperen Şengün has, 0 issues with his recovery timeline and is able to be ready to go for the start of next season, you realistically don't have a pathway for all 3 of those guys to get minutes at the 5 spot. And I think probably in a vacuum, you probably like Steven, assuming health permitting, right? You probably like Steven Adams more so as a contrast to Alperen Şengün as the backup 5 for this team next year. So what I think this does do is it opens up an opportunity for Jock Landale to kind of showcase himself, right? Because his value is probably, the lowest it's ever been earlier this season. So much so to the point where he was basically just, expiring salary. That's basically all the value he had as a player. Whereas now, depending on what the Rockets do, whether he starts, whether he comes off the bench in a larger role, which we're going to discuss kind of the rotation changes here in just a moment in our final segment. But what I do think it does is it allows an opportunity for the Rockets to kind of, pump up Jock Landale's value a little bit by giving him that extra burn, those extra minutes. And then you might be able to swing a deal where you can actually recoup some value for him this offseason to where you don't walk into next year with 3 centers on the roster and only 2 of them are going to be the guys getting playing time. You might actually be able to get, some kind of value, but late first or a few seconds or something for Jock Landale to a team that needs a serviceable center who can, potentially be a starter in a pinch. And honestly, on top of that, really team-friendly contract, right? Effectively, it's an expiring $8 million contract every single year with the team option to be able to pick it up every subsequent season.
Yeah, I mean, that provides a really powerful incentive for Jock Landale to go out there and play well. Because when he was terrible earlier this season, I looked at him purely as an expiring salary, and that they try to move him in this window right around the draft before you have to pick up the guarantee and use him as filler. And then if it doesn't work out, because at that point the filler is literally for $0 and that his salary for this season has already been paid and the guarantee for next year hasn't come into play yet. And then if you can't move him, if the right deal isn't there, then you might just have to cut him because, you just don't want to pay the guy $8 million if his play does not warrant it, even if theoretically he could be filler. With that said, the bar is really low. As long as he shows any value at all, $8 million for 1 year is really not that much in the modern NBA. So be it with the Rockets or for a trade with another team, the point is on that year-to-year contract, it doesn't take a lot for Landale to pass the bar in which it makes sense for the Rockets or any other team that has him to say, hey, you know what? Let's keep this guy. He's a functional player. He can help us at the end of our bench. And worst case scenario, he's salary filler, or maybe best case scenario. Let's be honest, because, there is some limit to Landale's upside as a player. But the point is, that's a pretty powerful incentive for a guy who earlier this year looked like, I didn't even know if he could land a minimum deal based on what he was showing in November and December. And now he can potentially earn his way into another year at $8 million. So that's a pretty powerful incentive. So not going to say the Rockets drew it up with exactly this scenario in mind, but it does provide a pretty clear incentive for him to go out and play hard. And he's been playing well the last few weeks. Now he's going to get a bigger sample. And then as far as Steven Adams, I'm just so relieved that we don't have to see Steven Adams stretched into a true starter's role. I was a little perturbed at how many people last night in the aftermath of how bad things looked with Şengün said something along the lines of, well, thank God they traded for Steven Adams. Whoa. Steven Adams was traded to be a backup, to fill a certain role now in his 30s and after 12 years in the NBA. Steven Adams is not going to replace Alperen Şengün. I don't care how good he is defensively, how tough. the workload, the playmaking responsibility that Şengün has, not just for himself, but to set the table for this entire offense, Steven Adams is not going to come close to that. Steven Adams was always meant to be a complement. And this scenario, it may help if for some reason Şengün is still building back strength going into training camp, then yeah, the presence of a guy like Adams maybe it allows you to keep Şengün at 25, 30 minutes per game early in the year while he's still working his way back into form. I could see that scenario, but I was a little surprised by how many people were acting like, well, the Şengün thing might not be so bad because you have Steven Adams. No. Steven Adams is nice as a depth piece. You do not want Steven Adams replacing Alperen Şengün as your starting center. That would be a massive hit to the way this team is constructed. Thank goodness we don't have to see that.
Yeah, and the final thing that I'll say in here is just, now that we know the severity of the recovery timeline and that it's not nearly as bad as we thought it was going to be, one of the fears that I had was just, especially after such a monumental year 3 here, really proving himself as kind of a franchise cornerstone type player, clearly the best of the young core 6 so far. There has been a little bit of, resistance towards, Alperen Şengün his first couple years with this Rockets team, right? It's just, there's been, he was, we can highlight the commentary, right? He was benched for Bruno Fernando last year in favor of, a piece
lob
that better.
Threat.
Yeah. Lob threat. I have the page here. Where is it?
Lob threat.
There it is. Right. So look, this is a guy that's had to overcome a lot in his career, and the Rockets front office absolutely still deserves credit for swinging the trade to get him in the first place.
100%.
But had this been an injury that was going to sideline him and have him, miss half of next season and even then potentially further than that to get up to speed, to get back to where his body was originally, then it might have spelled the end of Alperen Şengün in Houston, despite how good he was in that year 3, because in in the intermediary, you would have had to find a replacement for him. And it's really hard to find a guy that can do what Alperen Şengün can do. So the team probably would have had to shift to a completely different dynamic at the 5 spot, right? Leaning into maybe more of a defensive presence at the 5 or swinging a trade for a starting caliber kind of filler type player. Because like you said, right, Steven Adams is not that guy. You can't just throw Steven Adams into the deep end and say, go do what Şengün does, right? The team would not function that way. And so I'm very glad that it's not going to be something more severe that's going to have him out, an extended period of time. Hopefully he's good to go for the start of training camp next year. There are, as far as other silver linings though, we're going to get a very good look at some different Rockets lineups to close out this season. That's what we're going to talk about coming up here in just a moment. How do we expect the Rockets rotation? How do we expect the starters to change moving forward without Alperen Şengün? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the very next corner? Well, our friends over at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the very next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and for great escapes. Class-exclusive Google built-in is your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. Gone are the days of having to connect your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen right there at your fingertips. The 2024 Rogue is perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. Or hey, maybe you want a little bit more space, right? The 2024 Nissan Pathfinder has room for up to 8, an expansive cargo capacity, and advanced available 4x4 capability with 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing capacity. When adventure calls, the Pathfinder is right there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, when I look at where the Rockets stand now post Alperen Şengün injury, I think there's 2 very clear pathways forward to, mend the starting lineup, if you will. The first of which is very simple, cut and dry. Throw Jock Landale into the starting lineup, right? He's your backup big. He's actually been playing really well as of late. Throw him in there, and there's really not a drop. I mean, there's a drop off. Obviously, he's not Alperen Şengün, but right. You still have a big in the lineup. It doesn't change, anything drastically the way that you kind of play. He's even a bit of a serviceable passer, right? When he has the ball in the middle of the floor. Again, he's not Alperen Şengün, but we've seen some flashes from him. So that's one option. The other option is to insert Amin Thompson into the starting lineup and potentially slide Jabari Smith Jr. down to the 5 and just kind of see what, it's not quite small ball per se, but just a very switchy 5-man lineup where, Jabari Smith Jr. might not have enough sand in his pants to deal with some of the bigs, in the NBA landscape over these final, 20 some odd games or whatever. But it gives you a different look, right? It gives you a deeper look at what Jabari Smith Jr. at the 5 could look like, not necessarily full time, but over massive stretches of a game, which we really haven't seen much of this season because of how good Alperen Şengün has been. And then even Jeff Green dominating a lot of minutes as the backup small ball 5. And I think you can maybe get away with it because of how potent Amin Thompson has been as a defender as well as a rebounder. So between those two starting lineups, which way do you think the team ultimately goes and why?
So I think probably Landale, simply because it buys you some lower leverage minutes early in the first and third quarters. And that way, look, you've got to fill 240 minutes over a game. And the odds are Jock Landale is not going to be getting DNP CDs anymore. So if you view him as being lower upside, which I think is generally the case, then it probably makes sense to buy some of those minutes early in halves so that you have the option, if the higher upside guys, like your lineups with Jabari at the 5, Amin at the 4, or however you want to put it together on paper, so that you have more options later on, that you're not having to use those Landale minutes. So gun to my head, that's the way I would predict they go. Small chance that it's Jeff Green instead of Landale, but I think Landale's probably the front runner. However, one thing we should note is that the next 7 games are pretty easy. So, and I guess that we'll throw the asterisk on easy by the fact that the Rockets without Şengün are not the Rockets that we're used to. But look, of your next 7 games, 5 are at home, 2 are against the Wizards, who are terrible. You got a home and home against them. Wizards are 11-53. 1's against the Spurs. You've got Utah and Portland in there. We know how good the Rockets are at home. And the only road games, Spurs and Wizards. This is a pretty friendly stretch. And so because of that, this might be the period where you experiment with something like Jabari at the 5. Like, I don't think, like that stretch out of the All-Star break where you had the Pelicans with Valanciunas, you had the Suns with Nurkic, you had the Thunder with all of their guys. I don't think you would have done it then had Şengün not been available. That would have been terrible. However, this is a weaker point in the schedule where you could, if you squint hard enough, you could make the case for it, and there is more upside to this path. It's just, my guess is that because you're going to play Landale anyway, and I do think they want to reward him for playing well of late, my guess is you at least start the halves with him just so that you sort of buy some lower leverage minutes there. You see how he's playing. And, if he plays well, of course you can exceed his minutes, increase them even more. But then if not, you can follow up with those more creative lineups later on.
Yeah, and I do think, I fully agree. I think Landale is kind of the more so obvious choice, or the conventional choice, if you will, to just throw him into the starting lineup, because then you kind of go back to, okay, well, Jeff Green becomes your true backup 5 again, for the closing remainder of the season. And then you can run Jabari Smith Jr. at the 5 situationally, as long as the matchups matchups permitting. It
would also be so much easier, by the way, if you had Tari Eason. If you had Tari Eason to help with the length and the rebounding, then I think it'd be so much easier to put Jabari at the 5. One of the problems now is that you put Jabari at the 5. Yeah, you can theoretically slide him into the 4, but you're running out of bodies in a hurry. Now Cam Whitmore is out for Tuesday in San Antonio. He has a knee sprain. That's typically not a 1-game injury, although we have to wait for more information from Ime Udoka, so Cam's availability is in question. I guess you can throw Jae'Sean in the mix, but there's a reason he fell out of the rotation in the first place. There's no Tari, so it's like normally one of the appeals to putting Jabari at the 5 is that you have all these other playmakers that you can turn to. Well, now that you have all these injuries, the question is just how much basically depth do you have? Is it worth it to, get more scoring, more playmaking, more creation at these other spots when you're running out of depth at these other spots?
No, absolutely. And you're completely right. So first off, we're definitely going to see Jae'Sean back in the rotation. I think that's probably a really obvious, move here at this point. Is you're going to need, kind of innings eaters, right? You're going to need guys to just eat up some of the minutes, like
Perfect
you already said. There's 240 minutes across, one basketball game, and the Rockets just don't have enough bodies now that they have completely lost, a starting caliber player who played 35, 40 minutes a night in Alperen Şengün. So now, is it a guarantee it's Jae'Sean? Maybe it's some Reggie Bullock minutes here and there. Maybe ideally, right, we see an increase to the minutes for, Amin Thompson and Cam Whitmore, although their minutes have already been trending upwards as of late with, the continued trust and growth that they've shown, the trust from the coaching staff to, shoulder a bigger, burden and to do more on the basketball floor. But at the same time, you're just going to need bodies to throw out there. And My one thing with the whole Jabari thing at the 5 is I know that was an idea in the past that Ime Udoka was incredibly excited about, right? With just, the versatility that Jabari provides defensively. We know that Ime loves his switching defense schemes. And for the most part, he's only been switching 1 through 4 when Şengün is on the court. And even, when Jock Landale's out there, he only switches 1 through 4 and the 5 usually stays home. Now, if you go the Jabari route, then it might be a nice little kind of stretch of the season to just see, hey, what would the defensive scheme look like if we can switch everything 1 through 4, right? What if we really lean into that identity and, does that make us look like an even better defensive team? So, and being able to do it at the start of a game rather than like going to it 6 to 8 minutes into, the first quarter or whatever, I do wonder, especially for a guy like Jabari, if there's a drain on him, because do you pull Jabari out of the game early and then bring him back in to be the backup 5? Like, it gets a little weird when you get into kind of trying to stagger the minutes and make things work. I think my number one thing now is, now that the play-in is clearly going to be out of reach with no Alperen Şengün in the mix to close out the season, is I just want to see as much of the rest of the young guys as possible to close this season. And for me, what that means is, at some point, I wouldn't be shocked or surprised if they do shut down Fred VanVleet and or Dillon Brooks for any stretch of games to close the season, because once the play-in tournament it's already out of reach, they're still gathering data points. They're still collecting, as much useful information as possible. And those guys love to compete, right? Fred, Dillon, those guys are competitors through and through. They don't want to be shut down. They want to play. But the last thing you want to do is risk a severe injury to one of those 2 key pieces, your 2 of your veterans on the roster. And I do think you can kind of get away with the excuse of, hey, let's throw them into the starting lineup. Let's throw Cam into the starting lineup and just let them go on a tear for the final, 5 games, 10 games, whatever it is, and just go full youth movement to close out the season. You call up some of the Vipers guys, right? Bring up Nate Hinton, Jermaine Samuels, and just go complete youth movement to close out the year and just really let them kind of run the show.
Yeah, it's possible. We should also note that there is a small incentive, not a big one, but there is some incentive to maximize the top 4 odds kicking in to protect that pick that would otherwise be going to Oklahoma City. So if it's very late in the season and you've been eliminated, I know the odds are far less than 50-50 based on where the Rockets are in the standings. Now they've passed Utah for number 11 in the West, but look, as long as it's not 0, it's not like you can totally dismiss it. Any little bit helps. So between the reasons you laid out and the fact that pick going to OKC is top 4 protected, I don't see how you can at least consider it in the final few games of the year. And I would just say that for me, the reason I think they'll look into that, I do think these upcoming games are important. I've referenced, and this is sort of piggybacking off of Ime Udoka's comments coming out of the All-Star break, he broke this season down into thirds. The first third going into Christmas, they were 15-12. Everything looked great, way ahead of expectations. Middle third, going into the All-Star break, you had all the injuries, Fred, Dillon, Tari, Jabari. You went 9-18, largely off the rails. That's where the play-in dream largely died. And now you've got these final 28, the last third coming out of the All-Star break. And we've talked about that being important for a baseline. And one of the things I worried about, immediately after Şengün went down last night, are we going to get that? Because what I do want to know coming out of this season, are the Rockets closer to that first third or to the second third? And over the last 10 games, they're 5-5 out of the break, but it's been a hard schedule. We're talking the next 7 being easy. Look, the past 10, 8 of them have come against the Suns, the Thunder, the Clippers on night 2 of a back-to-back, the Pelicans, the Kings on the road. These are all likely West playoff teams. So it has been a tough go for the Rockets. They're 5-5. They're 4-1 in their last 5. And now you've got 7 in a row. You do have one home game against the Cavs in there. But other than that, I mean, you're going to be favored in most of these games, even without Alperen Şengün. So if the Rockets are closer to that first third team rather than the second third, then that's important to me because, I want to feel like that just based on how they are, that this is a 500-ish team. And then you factor in adding in Steven Adams, or whatever other trades or something about making the offseason, then we can talk about taking a jump into actually being a winning team and, maybe even the playoffs next season. That's definitely the ambition. But the question is, of course, do you have enough to make that judgment about the final third? And that's where I think you take a step back and you realize, hey, they've already played 10 games and it's good competition, gone 5-5. The veterans have gotten their second win. Some of the young guys are increasingly figuring it out more. And then these next 7 games, no disrespect to Alperen Şengün, but if you go 1-6 against the teams they have coming up, I don't think it'd be reasonable to say, oh, they They would have gone 6-1 if they had all P. He's a very good player. He is not at that level yet. So because of that, I feel like at the end of this upcoming, let's call it a 17-game run. They played 10, and you've got the 7 coming up that are fairly easy. You're going to have an idea by the end of that stretch as to whether this Rockets team is closer to the pre-Christmas version, the first third, or that second third. And so at that point, I think you will have your data points. And so as you go into the final 10 games and you're either eliminated or close to it, then at that point, I think that's when you'll see them make the more strategic long-term decisions. Like, hey, there's no reason to play out the string with a guy like Fred or Dillon. Let's evaluate the young guys more, maximize, it may be a small probability, but it's not nothing, the odds of your top 4 protection kicking in. So I think it's just worth noting that the way the schedule sort of lines up, yes, you're going to be injury depleted the next week or two, but your schedule is also weaker. So because of that, you are still going to be able to sort of get the data you need about the group as a whole. And then I think going into the last 10 games, when the schedule, at least on paper, gets tougher. Now, you never know, because other teams may be resting their guys in advance of the playoffs as well. The NBA is always sort of wonky the last couple of weeks of the year. But I just think the way the schedule lays out, combined with these injuries, makes it sort of a natural point heading into the final 10 games, where I think that's sort of the pivot point for the Rockets to think a little bit bigger picture with their decision-making.
And final point here to make is, Alperen Şengün is such an important focal point of this Rockets offense. He was their go-to guy. He was, irrefutably their number one option, leading scorer, all that. You're going to have to make up those points somewhere. You're going to have to make up those field goal attempts somewhere. So that means bigger offensive roles for ideally, right, guys like Jalen Green, guys like Jabari Smith Jr. Maybe we see a bigger role for Cam Whitmore offensively, right? You're going to have to distribute those shots
he's healthy
somewhere,
yeah.
if he's healthy, right? Health permitting for Cam Whitmore. Basketball gods they weren't done with him, right? Look, if Cam Whitmore sacrificed his knee for a handful of games so that Alperen Şengün didn't miss half of next season, so be it. Basketball gods,
as long
fine.
as it's not an ACL, as long as it's not an ACL. But yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You're going to have to find more offense from the creators. And the good news is that since the All-Star break, look, Fred seems to have gotten his juice back. He seems to be moving better. Jalen has increasingly played well of late. You're not going to drop in Jock Landale or Jeff Green into the offense as it was constructed. You're going to need those perimeter guys to take on bigger workloads. And the analogy I made on Twitter, and I'm going to stand by it, losing Alperen Şengün, it's like taking the training wheels off your bike. For those other guys, they have fared a lot better in recent games, but Alperen Şengün draws so much attention that many times those other 4 guys, they're basically playing 4-on-3 because a help defender has already committed to Şengün. Now the training wheels are off. You're going to need to see Fred and Jalen and I guess Jabari. Now, Jabari's not a downhill guy, but he can create his own offense at times. You're going to need to see those guys just go out and win some one-on-one battles. Go out and, the guards go downhill and create, drive and kick. Jabari rise and fire more from mid-range. And I think the real way that it's going to change relative to Şengün, when you have Şengün, a lot of those other guys, of course, they'll take their shots early in a game, but if they're not hitting on a given night, you'll see the field goal attempts go down. Because especially if it's a high leverage spot, the Rockets know, look, all P is where their bread is buttered. And so he's the guy that you're going to run through. We even saw that in Sacramento, where before the injury, Alperen had a couple of big buckets late in that game to sort of unlock what had been a pretty stagnant offense. As opposed to now that there's no security blanket of Alperen, you don't have that guy. Then if you're Fred, if you're Jalen, if you're Jabari, I don't care if you start 1 of 10, you've got to keep firing because there's not going to be a clearly better option. That's what's going to change. And so beyond the fact they're going to have to win.
The difference is on that point, though, I don't want to see it turn into the end of Jalen's rookie year, right? Where Jalen and KPJ were just given full reign and it was your turn, my turn for the final 7-8 games. And yeah, they were scoring, 30 plus a night and everything, but they were, it was clunky. It didn't feel, I still want to see it done within the flow of an offense, right?
Yeah, you do need to. Yeah, you do need to run the offense.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be just chucking. But what I'm saying is you can't sort of rely on having that one guy, which Şengün was, as a bailout, as a security blanket. You can't lose confidence, which at times has been a thing for Jalen Green this year. You've got to realize that, look, you are playing shorthanded. You've lost your him, so to speak. So those other guys, yeah, I mean, there's a fine line. You don't want it to deviate into chucking to where you're just throwing up shots no matter what, but you can't get discouraged and say, this isn't my night. No, I mean, if the shot's there, you need to take it. Now it needs to be within the flow of the offense, all those caveats, but yeah, you've got to play disciplined system ball. It's just now the training wheels are off. You can't just go back to all P or rely on him to generate huge advantages elsewhere on the floor. You've got to win those battles. You've got to keep attacking, and you've got to keep doing it because you don't have that much else the way you typically do when you have a young star like Alperen Şengün on your roster.
Who do you want to see inserted into the Houston Rockets starting lineup in place of Alperen Şengün? Do you want to see it be Jock Landale? Do you want to see Amin Thompson get a crack at it and move Jabari Smith Jr. down to the 5 spot? Let us know in the YouTube comments. Give us your thoughts on everything we discussed in today's episode. Always looking out for those comments on YouTube. But Ben, you know the drill. Let everybody know where they can track you down at.
Yep, Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Logger Line on Twitter, and the Rockets Wire on Twitter, or X, I guess. But yeah, for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage, and of course, rocketswire.usatoday.com for the website.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and if you're listening to the podcast feeds, leave a 5-star review. That would help us out a ton. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.